The attic of the house on Lowell Road smelled of cedar, aging paper, and the slow, dignified decay of forgotten things. For Eleanor Vance, it was a sanctuary of memory, a quiet archive of the life she and Liam had built. On that particular November afternoon, with the sky the color of a faded bruise and the last of the maple leaves clinging desperately to their branches, she was on a mission of filial duty. Her parents' 50th anniversary was approaching, and she was the designated curator of the family slideshow, tasked with excavating photos from the strata of their shared past. Liam's old drafting case, a handsome leather relic from his university days, was tucked beneath a stack of his mother's quilts. He was an architect, a man who built things, sleek glass and steel structures that defied gravity and spoke of the future. It was one of the many paradoxes of their life that he, a modernist at heart, had fallen in love with and poured a decade of his life into restoring this 1880s Victorian, a labyrinth of dark wood, intricate moldings, and rooms that held their breath. Eleanor ran her hand over the worn leather of the case. She was looking for a specific series of photos from a long-ago trip to Nantucket, and she remembered Liam using the case to protect them. The brass latches clicked open with a satisfyingly solid sound. Inside, nestled among faded blueprints and charcoal sketches of buildings that now stood gleaming in Boston's Seaport District, was something that did not belong. It was a moleskin journal, its black cover smooth and unmarked, its presence a stark, modern anomaly in the dusty context of the past. Curiosity, cool and sharp, pricked at her. Liam wasn't a journal keeper. He was a man of grand gestures and public statements, not private introspection. His thoughts were externalized in steel beams and floor-to-ceiling windows, not in cramped, inky script. She lifted it. It felt heavy in her hands, heavier than its size suggested. She opened it to a random page in the middle. The handwriting was his, a familiar, angular script, yet the words were utterly alien. They were arranged not in prose, but in verse, a poem. Stella, my star, my northern light, you broke the long and settled night. The world was monochrome and gray until you dawned and showed the way. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Stella? Who was Stella? A cold dread, slick and oily, began to seep into the quiet corners of her mind. She flipped back to the beginning. The first entry was dated 3 months prior, August, the month they'd spent at the Cape, a time she had cataloged in her memory as placid, sun-drenched, unremarkable. Page after page, the poems unfolded, a secret narrative of a love that was not hers. They were filled with cliché, perhaps, but they were undeniably passionate. He wrote of stolen glances over coffee, of a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, of hair the color of whiskey. He wrote of her light, her fire, her unbridled spirit. He called her Stella, his star, a celestial body in a sky he had thought was empty. Eleanor sank onto an old sea chest, the dust motes dancing in the single beam of light from the dormer window. The air grew thin, the smell of cedar cloying. Each word was a small, precise incision. Liam, her Liam, the man who hadn't written her a line of poetry since their courtship, who now communicated in shared calendars and brief texts about grocery lists, had been pouring his heart out to a ghost, a star. The world wasn't monochrome and gray. Their world was a rich tapestry of color she had meticulously woven. It was the deep burgundy of the dining room walls they had chosen together, the vibrant green of the hydrangeas she babied in the garden, the warm gold of the late afternoon sun slanting across the worn pages of the books in her study. He had taken their life, their shared reality, and rendered it a black and white photograph, a colorless backdrop for his vibrant, secret affair. She read until her eyes burned. The poems detailed a progression, an emotional affair blossoming in the sterile environment of a work project. He mentioned blueprints, site visits, the thrill of secrecy, the torment of a divided heart. A line leaped out at her. brutal in its simplicity. In her arms, I am a man reborn. In my home, I am a ghost in scorn. A dry, rattling sob escaped her lips. A ghost, that's what she was. The quiet, efficient curator of his home, the editor of his press releases, the keeper of his social schedule, the stable, predictable ground from which he could leap toward his star. She closed the journal, the silence of the attic roaring in her ears. For 18 years, her life had been a narrative she'd co-authored with him. It was a story of intellectual partnership, mutual respect, and quiet, enduring love. It was a story she had edited and polished, excising the messy, inconvenient truths, highlighting the romantic passages. Now she saw it for what it was, a work of fiction, and she was its most gullible reader. Downstairs, the house was silent. Liam was at a site meeting in Cambridge. She walked through the rooms, touching the things they had chosen together. The antique sideboard, the Eames chair that was his one concession to modernity in the living room, the framed map of Paris from their honeymoon. Each object was now an artifact from a fraudulent past, a prop in a play where she was the only one who didn't know her lines were a lie. She went into her study, a room lined with books from floor to ceiling. This was her domain. Here, words were her tools. She was a textual scholar, a dissector of language. She understood nuance, subtext, the power of a well-placed comma. She looked at the moleskin journal lying on her desk, a black hole that had swallowed her world. Rage, cold and pure, began to crystallize over the raw wound of her grief. It wasn't the hot, screaming rage of a soap opera. It was the precise, icy fury of an editor who has found a fatal flaw in a manuscript, a lie that unravels the entire premise. She picked up her favorite fountain pen, a one with the fine nib filled with a deep, blood-red ink she used for her most critical edits. She opened the journal again to the first poem. Stella, my star, my northern light, you broke the long and settled night. Her own hand was steady as she began to write on the blank-facing page. The words did not come from a place of reason, but from a deeper, more visceral well of truth. Her script was a sharp, elegant counterpoint to his. A star? You call that fleeting spark a star? While your true sun sits waiting in the car and pays the bills and mends the garden gate and marks the endless, thankless settled date? This night you curse had warmth and bread and wine, a world you built, a world that was half mine. She closed the book and placed it back in the drafting case, exactly where she had found it. She zipped the case and placed the quilts back on top, smoothing the fabric with a chilling sense of calm. The archaeologist had found her relic. Now the editor would begin her work. The war had begun, and it would be fought silently, in ink on the pages of his heart. The days that followed were a masterclass in dissociation. Eleanor moved through her life with a terrifying, brittle composure. She made coffee in the morning, listened to Liam talk about zoning permits and problematic HVAC systems, and nodded in all the right places. But she was watching him from a great glacial distance. Every gesture, every word was now filtered through the lens of the journal. His casual touch on her shoulder felt like a violation. His laughter, once a warm and familiar sound, now seemed hollow, a performance for an audience of one. The house, her meticulously curated sanctuary, became a hostile environment. The silence in its rooms was no longer peaceful, it was accusatory. The floorboards seemed to groan with the weight of his lies. She found herself staring at the crack in the plaster above their bed, a fine, spidery line she had meant to have repaired for months. It was a fault line, a perfect physical metaphor for the seismic shift that had occurred beneath the surface of their lives. 2 days after her discovery, Liam mentioned he needed to go up to the attic to get some old project files. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She sat in her study, feigning absorption in a dense manuscript on postmodern feminism, and listened to his footsteps creak on the floorboards above her head. She heard the scrape of the drafting case being moved, the click of the latches. A silence stretched, taut and agonizing. Then the footsteps again, retreating. The attic door closed with a soft thud. She waited an hour, then another, before she could bring herself to go up. The case was back in its place. She opened it. The Moleskine was there. Her breath hitched. She opened it to the page after his last entry, a new poem, in his familiar black ink. He hadn't noticed her reply. He was so lost in his fantasy, so certain of his secrecy, that he hadn't even looked at the facing page. The arrogance of it was a fresh stab of pain. This new poem was about their hands, Stella's hands. Your hands on the clay, a potter's grace, shaping a world in that sunlit space. My hands draw lines, all rigid and stark. Yours find the life that's hid in the dark. It was sentimental, it was overwrought, and it was a dagger. Eleanor thought of her own hands, the ink stains on her right index finger, the faint scar on her thumb from a bread knife, the dry skin from pulling weeds in the garden. These were the hands that had typed his graduate school applications, that had held his head during a vicious bout of flu, that had smoothed the sheets on their bed for 6,570 nights. She took out her red pen. The fury was a physical thing, a hot coil in her stomach. These hands you forget, they are not of clay. They are flesh and bone at the end of the day. They signed the mortgage. They balanced the books. They scrubbed out the stains of your furtive looks. You praise the hands that shape transient art, while these hands hold the pieces of your broken heart. This became their silent, terrible ritual. Every few days, he would add to his secret scripture. He would write of her scent, lilacs, her voice, honey, her soul, a wild, untamed thing. He was not describing a woman. He was building a myth, a goddess to worship, so unlike the mortal, complicated woman he came home to every night. And every time, Eleanor would answer. Her verses were a brutal counter-narrative. When he wrote of Stella's wild spirit, she wrote of the PTA meetings he missed. When he praised Stella's wisdom, she wrote of the therapist bills for their son's anxiety, which he had dismissed as a phase. Her poems were an indictment, penned in the blood-red ink of an editor's corrections. They were filled with the mundane, painful, concrete details of their life together. The leaky faucet he never fixed, the anniversary he forgot, the time she had a cancer scare and he was too busy with a deadline to go to the hospital for the biopsy results. The journal was her obsession. It was the first thing she thought of in the morning and the last thing she touched at night. Her own work piled up, deadlines looming. She would stare at manuscripts, her clients' carefully crafted arguments blurring into meaningless symbols. The only words that mattered were the ones in that black Moleskine. "You seem distracted," Liam said one evening, looking at her over the rim of his wine glass. They were having dinner, the table set perfectly, the meal a recipe she had spent hours on. "Just a difficult project," she said, her voice even. "Zen's subject matter." "You should take a break," he said, the concern in his voice a grotesque parody. "We should go away for a weekend, just us." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. She wanted to scream. She wanted to take the journal and slam it down on the table between them, to watch the fantasy shatter in his eyes. But she couldn't. The poems were her armor. In the silent war of the journal, she had control. She had the last word. A real-life confrontation felt like a surrender, a descent into messy, unpredictable emotion. Here, in ink, she was powerful. She called Anika. "I need to see you," she said, her voice tight. They met at a coffee shop in Cambridge, a neutral territory away from the charged atmosphere of her house. Anika, with her calm, intelligent eyes and her air of profound competence, listened without interruption as Eleanor told her everything. She didn't spare a detail, from the smell of the attic to the brand of the journal. When she finished, Anika was silent for a long moment, stirring her chai latte. "My God, Elle, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," Eleanor said, her voice brittle. "Be impressed. My verses are much better than his. His are maudlin. Mine have iambic integrity." Anika reached across the table and placed a hand over Eleanor's. It was trembling. "This isn't a literary competition, Eleanor. This is your life." "It is a literary competition," she insisted, pulling her hand away. "He created a fiction. I'm deconstructing it. It's what I do. I find a flawed logic, the weak premises. I'm editing his life." "And what happens when you're done?" Anika asked gently. "When you've redlined every page, what's left?" The question hung in the air between them. What was left? Eleanor imagined the journal, filled with his black ink and her red, a chaotic testament to a collapsed marriage. She had no answer. "The rage is a shield. I get that," Anika continued, her voice soft but firm. "It's easier to be angry than to feel the grief, the humiliation, the terror. But Eleanor, that journal is a black hole. It's consuming you. You're not just responding to him, you're chaining yourself to his betrayal. Every poem you write keeps you tethered to it." Eleanor shook her head. "It's the only thing that feels real right now." "What you're doing is brilliant," Anika conceded. "It's a powerful, articulate expression of rage, but it's not a solution. It's a holding pattern. Sooner or later, Elle, the plane has to land." That night, she found a new poem. It was different, more desperate. "I live in two worlds, torn by the seam. One is the truth, one is the dream. I don't know the man in my own reflection. He seeks your light for his soul's protection." For the first time, a crack appeared in her own icy resolve. She saw not the arrogant adulterer, but a man lost, a man so disconnected from his own life that he didn't recognize himself. The rage wavered, and underneath it, a vast, dark ocean of sorrow churned. She picked up her red pen, but this time her hand hesitated. She wrote, but the words were different. The fury was still there, but it was laced with a profound, aching sadness. "You think you're torn? A soul split in two? Look at the woman who lies next to you. She is the seam you so carelessly ripped, the ghost in the house with a silent screamed lip. You seek a light? Turn your head on the pillow and see the shade you've cast from your own weeping willow." She put the journal away. The victory felt hollow. The landing Anika had spoken of was coming, and she was terrified of the crash. The seasons were turning. The last of the leaves had fallen, and the trees stood like skeletons against the darkening sky. Winter was coming. For Liam Vance, the world had become a place of exhilarating, terrifying dissonance. His life was a carefully constructed diptych. On one side was Concord, the historic house, the comfortable silences with his wife, the weight of shared history, the oppressive but reassuring predictability of it all. It was real, solid, and lately, it had felt as airless as a tomb. On the other side was Stella, Claire. She was light and laughter and the intoxicating thrill of the new. With her, he wasn't Liam Vance, established architect, husband, father of a college-aged son. He was a poet, a romantic hero, a man of deep, hidden passions. The affair was a fantasy, a carefully curated narrative he constructed in the pages of his moleskin. The poems weren't just for her, they were for him. They were proof that he was still alive, still capable of feeling something profound. He was compartmentalizing. He knew the term. He was an architect. He dealt in separate, functional spaces. This was no different. The journal was the secret door between the two rooms of his life. He would steal moments, in his car after a site visit, late at night in his study after Eleanor had gone to bed, to pour his idealized emotions onto the page. It was a pressure valve. Lately, though, the pressure had been building elsewhere. A chill had descended on his home that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. Eleanor was distant, her politeness a thin sheet of ice over something deep and cold. She looked at him, but she didn't seem to see him. He attributed it to her work, to the general malaise of a long marriage. He told himself it was nothing. He had just finished a new poem, one he felt was his best yet. It was about the concept of home, how home was no longer a place, but a person, Stella. He felt a familiar cocktail of guilt and exhilaration as he climbed the stairs to the attic. He needed to put it away before Eleanor got back from her walk. He opened the drafting case, his hands going for the moleskine. As he lifted it, it fell open. It didn't fall open to a blank page. It fell open to a page of angry, red script, facing one of his own poems. His first thought was confusion. What is this? He looked closer. The handwriting was elegant, familiar. It was Eleanor's. He read the words. "A star? You called that fleeting spark a star? While your true sun sits waiting in the car." The blood drained from his face. A roaring sound filled his ears, like the ocean. He stumbled back, knocking against a stack of boxes. It couldn't be. He frantically flipped the pages. There it was again, red ink facing his black, page after page, a silent, screaming dialogue he had been completely oblivious to. His romantic, idealized verses and her brutal, surgical responses. He wrote of Stella's soul. She wrote of their son's therapy bills. He wrote of their stolen moments. She wrote of the anniversary he forgot. He wrote of living in two worlds. She wrote of being the seam he had ripped apart. It was a systematic, meticulous demolition of his fantasy. Each of her verses was a wrecking ball, smashing his carefully constructed illusions. She wasn't screaming or crying or throwing plates. She was doing something far more devastating. She was using their shared language, the language of literature, of metaphor, of art, to hold up a mirror to his soul, and the reflection was grotesque. He saw himself not as the romantic hero of his poems, but as the pathetic, self-deluding cliché she painted him to be. The man who praised the hands of his mistress while ignoring the hands that held his life together. The man who cursed the settled night that was, in fact, a warm, safe harbor he had taken for granted. He sank to the floor of the attic, the journal open in his lap. The smell of cedar was suffocating. He felt dizzy, nauseous. The red ink seemed to glow on the page, the color of shame, of a wound laid bare. He had thought he was being so clever, so careful, but he hadn't been careful at all. He had been a fool, writing a fairy tale in the middle of a war zone he hadn't even known existed. Her intelligence, which he had long ago begun to take for granted, to even find quietly intimidating, was now revealed in its full, terrifying power. She had not confronted him. She had not made a scene. She had entered his most secret space, the very sanctuary of his deceit, and she had claimed it. She had turned his own weapon against him, and her aim was lethally precise. He read every one of her responses, his heart pounding with a sick, rhythmic dread. The poems weren't just angry. They were filled with a pain so profound it was almost unbearable to read. This was the reality of what he had done. Not the romantic torment he had written about, but this raw, detailed, specific agony. The ghost in the house with a silent screamed lip. He finally understood the chill in their house. It wasn't a mood, it was grief. He finally understood the distance in her eyes. It wasn't distraction, it was revulsion. He had been living in a dream, and she had been living in a nightmare right beside him. He sat there for what felt like hours, the winter light fading outside the single window. The cold of the attic floor seeped into his bones. He felt hollowed out, scoured. The fantasy of Stella evaporated like mist, leaving behind only the ugly, sordid truth of his betrayal and the immense scale of the damage he had wrought. He picked up his pen His hands were shaking so badly he could barely form the letters. He turned to the last blank page in the journal. There were no more poems for Stella. There was nothing left for her. The light she had supposedly brought into his life was a cheap illusion, and it had been extinguished by the fierce, terrible, righteous glare of his wife's red ink. He began to write, but it wasn't a poem. It was a confession, a surrender. The words were stark, broken, stripped of all artifice. Eleanor, I read your words, all of them. There is no Stella. There was never a star. Just a black hole I created myself. I am the ghost. I am the monochrome. I am sorry are just words, and I have broken all the words. He couldn't write anymore. He closed the journal. He walked down the attic stairs, each step heavy, an old man descending into the ruins of his own making. He went into their bedroom, the room where they had slept side by side for nearly decades, while he dreamt of other women and she apparently had listened to his lies in her sleep. He placed the moleskine on the center of the bed, right on her pillow. He left it open to the page with his last desperate message. There was nowhere left to hide. The landing was here. Eleanor saw the journal the moment she walked into the bedroom. It lay on her pillow, a black slash against the white linen, open like a wound. Her heart stopped. This was it. The silent war was over. The confrontation she had both craved and dreaded was upon her. She walked slowly toward the bed, her legs feeling unsteady. Her own red ink seemed to pulse on the page, a testament to months of fury. She saw his familiar black script on the facing page, but it was different. It was jagged, frantic. She read his confession. There is no Stella, just a black hole I created myself. I am the ghost. The words didn't bring the satisfaction she might have expected. There was no triumph, no sense of victory. The rage that had been her constant companion for months, the cold, sharp fury that had fueled her and given her purpose, simply dissolved. In its place was a vast, hollow emptiness, a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. He had seen it. He knew. The game was over, and all she was left with was the wreckage. She heard him downstairs, the clink of a glass. He was waiting. She closed the journal and placed it on her nightstand. She looked at her reflection in the antique dresser mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger. Her face was thinner, her eyes shadowed, etched with a tension that hadn't been there a season ago. She had poured all of her energy, all of her intellect into this battle of wits, and it had cost her dearly. She went downstairs. Liam was standing by the window in the living room, staring out at the skeletal branches of the oak tree in their front yard. He was holding a glass of whiskey, but he hadn't drunk any of it. He turned as she entered the room, and his face was a ruin. The confident, easy charm was gone, replaced by a raw, naked shame. The silence was the loudest thing in the room. It was thick with everything that had been written in the journal, with 18 years of shared history and 3 months of devastating lies. He started, his voice cracking. He stopped, swallowed. I don't know what to say. You said it all in the journal, Eleanor said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. She was too tired for emotion. And I said it all back. I am so sorry, Elle. The words were a cliché, but the despair behind them was real. He looked utterly broken. I was a fool, a coward. You were, she agreed. There was no heat in her affirmation, only a simple statement of fact. She sat down in the armchair by the fireplace, the one where she read on winter evenings. It felt like a throne of ice. He remained standing, as if he didn't deserve to sit in his own home. Why didn't you just confront me? Why the poems? It was the question she had been asking herself. Because, she said, thinking of Anika's words, Screaming felt like a surrender. Writing felt like control. You took my life and turned it into a cheap fiction. I just edited it. I corrected the narrative. It was the only way I could make it make sense. It wasn't a fiction about you, he said desperately. It was a fiction about me, about some version of me I wanted to be. Someone who wasn't this, middle-aged, predictable, the guy who designs sensible corporate lobbies. It had nothing to do with you, not really. You are perfect. The word perfect hung in the air, a final, unintentional insult. That was the problem, Liam, she said, her voice quiet but gaining a sliver of its old sharp edge. I was never perfect. I am difficult and opinionated, and I leave my books everywhere, and I often prefer the company of dead authors to living people. But you stopped seeing me. You saw a character you had created, the capable wife, the stable partner. You put me on a pedestal of competence and then resented me for not being a damsel in distress you could rescue. Stella wasn't real, but neither was the Eleanor you were married to. You were having an affair with a fantasy to escape a marriage with a ghost. Tears were streaming down his face now, silent and unheeded. "What did I do?" he whispered, more to himself than to her. "What did I do?" "You broke it," she said simply. "The narrative, the one we wrote together. And I don't know if there are enough words in the world to put it back together." The silence returned, heavier this time. It was a silence of endings. The end of the war, the end of the lies, the end of the marriage as they had known it. "I'll go," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I'll pack a bag, find a hotel." Eleanor nodded, a small, tired gesture. "I think that would be for the best." He didn't argue. He just turned and walked toward the stairs. She listened to his footsteps, the opening and closing of drawers, the zip of a suitcase. Sounds she had heard 100 times before a business trip, but this time, the finality was absolute. When he came back down, he stood in the doorway of the living room, his coat on, his suitcase by his side. He looked like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house. "The crack in the plaster," he said suddenly, his voice thick. "Above the bed. I'll call someone to fix it tomorrow." Eleanor stared at him. After all this, his architect's mind had fixated on the one small physical flaw. It was so quintessentially Liam that a humorless, painful laugh almost escaped her. "Don't," she said. "Just leave it." He nodded, his eyes filled with a world of regret. "Okay." And then he was gone. The front door clicked shut, and the silence that descended was different. It wasn't accusatory anymore. It was just empty, a vast, echoing void. She was alone in her beautiful, broken house, the victor of a war she had never wanted to fight, and all she felt was the profound, crushing weight of her loss. The plane had landed. The first week of Liam's absence was a study in profound, deafening silence. The house, which had been the battlefield, the stage, and the prison of her secret war, was now just a house. It was too big. The sounds were all wrong. The creak of the stairs was just the house settling, not Liam coming home. The hum of the refrigerator was a lonely monologue. The journal sat on her nightstand, a closed, inert object. Its power was gone. Without the cycle of betrayal and response, it was just a notebook filled with painful memories. She took it, went into her study, and placed it in a box. She labeled the box Vance Private with her editor's pen and shoved it onto the highest shelf of her closet behind a stack of out-of-season sweaters. A final act of archival. Her sessions with Annika became her lifeline. The rage was a fuel, Annika said during one of their video calls, her face a small, compassionate rectangle on Eleanor's laptop screen. It kept you moving, kept you focused. Now the fuel is gone, and you're left with the engine, which is your grief. You have to let yourself feel it, Elle, all of it. And she did. The grief came in waves, unpredictable and overwhelming. It ambushed her in the grocery store, staring at the brand of coffee Liam liked. It washed over her as she drove past the park where they used to walk. It was a physical ache, a hollowness in her chest that made it difficult to eat, to sleep, to read. She was grieving not just the man she thought she had married, but the woman she had been. The woman who believed in the solidity of her own life, in the story she had so carefully constructed. Her sister, Jessica, called from San Diego, her voice a blast of Californian pragmatism. "So, have you hired a forensic accountant yet? You need to lock down the assets, Ellie. Men do stupid things when they're emotional. Don't be a victim twice." "I'm not a victim," Eleanor said, though the words felt hollow. "And I don't want to think about accountants right now." "You need to be practical. This isn't some 19th century novel where you waste away from a broken heart. This is reality. Get what's yours and build a new life, a better one, with a pool." Eleanor knew Jessica meant well, but her advice felt like it was from another planet. Her pain was not a logistical problem to be solved with lawyers and spreadsheets. It was a fundamental crisis of self. Who was she, if not Liam's wife? Who was she, if not one half of the Vances? The winter deepened, burying Concord in a thick blanket of snow. The world outside her window was rendered in shades of white and gray, a perfect reflection of her inner landscape. The house felt like a snow globe, a beautiful, static scene of a life that was no longer real. One morning, staring out the kitchen window at the backyard, she focused on the garden. It was a mess. She had abandoned it in the fall, too consumed by the journal to bother with the end-of-season chores. The dead stalks of her prize-winning delphiniums stood like brittle skeletons in the frozen earth. The rose bushes were untrimmed, vulnerable to the harsh winds. Something shifted in her. She put on her boots, her heaviest coat, and her gloves. She went outside into the biting cold and began to work. Her fingers grew numb almost instantly. Her breath plumed in the frigid air. She pulled at the frozen stalks of last year's life, the stems snapping with a dry, cracking sound. She pruned the rose bushes, the thorns tearing at her coat. It was hard, punishing, physical work, and it was the first thing that had felt real in months. Each dead stalk she pulled was a small act of clearing. Each precise cut of the shears was an act of shaping, of preparing for a future she couldn't yet imagine. She was not editing a text, she was tending to the earth. She was not correcting a narrative, she was cultivating the possibility of new growth. Liam communicated through brief, formal emails. He had found a furnished apartment in Somerville. He had started seeing a therapist. He made no demands, no excuses. His messages were stripped of the poetic artifice she now despised, and in their place was a stark, humble honesty. He was doing the work. She didn't know what that meant for them, and for the first time, she realized she didn't need to know. Her own work was right here, in this frozen garden, in the silent rooms of this house, in the quiet, terrifying, and exhilarating process of rediscovering her own center. As the snows began to melt, revealing the muddy, scarred earth beneath, she began to write again. Not in red ink, not in response to anyone. She bought a new journal, a simple one, with a pale blue cover. She wrote for herself. She wrote about the way the winter light fell across the bare wood floors. She wrote about the ghost feeling of a hand on her back. She wrote about the surprising, fierce beauty of the first crocus pushing its way through the half-frozen mud. Her poems were not about betrayal or rage. They were about solitude, about memory, about the complex, painful, and resilient architecture of a single human heart. She was finding her own voice again, a voice that was not defined by its opposition to his, but one that stood on its own. Spring arrived in New England not with a grand announcement, but in a series of small, hesitant gestures. The tight, glossy buds on the maple trees, the return of the robins, their chests a defiant slash of orange against the pale sky. The air, which for months had been sharp enough to cut, softened, carrying the scent of damp earth and possibility. Eleanor felt the shift inside her as well. The hollow ache in her chest had not disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer a gaping wound, but a scar, a place of remembered pain, but also a testament to healing, to the skin that had knit itself back together, stronger in the broken places. She was working again. Her focus returned. Her study was once more a place of intellectual comfort, not an armory. She had taken down the heavy velvet curtains in the living room, letting the bright, clear light flood the space. The house was beginning to feel like hers alone. Even the crack in the bedroom ceiling had started to look less like a flaw and more like a feature, a unique line on a familiar map. An email from Liam arrived on a bright April morning. "Eleanor, I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I was wondering if you would be willing to meet, to talk. Not about us, necessarily, just to talk. I will understand completely if the answer is no." She read it 3 times. The tone was so different from the man who had written the Moleskine poems. This was tentative, respectful. This was the voice of a man who had been humbled. She thought of Jessica's advice, "Don't even reply." She thought of the woman she had been 6 months ago, who would have analyzed the request for subtext, for manipulation. But the woman she was now simply felt a quiet curiosity. She wrote back, "Yes, the public garden, Saturday at 2. She chose the location deliberately. It was neutral ground, a place of public beauty that held no specific memories for them. As she walked across the footbridge over the lagoon, watching the swan boats glide serenely across the water, she felt a surprising calm. She was not here to negotiate a reconciliation or to rehash the past. She was here as herself, Eleanor Vance, a woman meeting a man she had once known better than anyone in the world. He was waiting on a bench near the George Washington statue, and for a moment, she barely recognized him. He had lost weight. There were new lines around his eyes. He looked older, more thoughtful, less certain. The architect's arrogance had been replaced by a quiet vulnerability. "Thank you for coming," he said, standing as she approached. "Liam," she said, a simple acknowledgement. They spoke for over an hour, the conversation stilted at first, then flowing more easily. He didn't make excuses. He spoke of his therapy, of the painful work of dismantling the fictions he had built around himself. He talked about realizing that his pursuit of Stella wasn't about love or passion, but about a desperate, pathetic fear of his own mortality, his own ordinariness. "I was running away from myself," he said, looking at his hands, "and I used you, and her, and our whole life as the scenery I was running through. It was a monstrously selfish thing to do." Eleanor listened. She didn't offer absolution, she didn't offer comfort. She simply listened, and in his words, she heard the echo of her own journey, the painful process of facing the truth. He had been deconstructed, just as she had been. "I sold my share in the firm," he said. "I'm going to do something smaller, maybe teach. I want to build things that matter, not just things that are impressive." She saw a flicker of the man she had first fallen in love with, the idealistic young student who wanted to design beautiful, functional spaces for people to live in. "And you?" he asked, his voice gentle. "How are you?" She thought of her garden, the green shoots now pushing through the dark soil. She thought of her new journal, its pages filling with her own words. She thought of the light in her house. "I'm all right," she said, and it was the truth. "I'm finding my way back to myself." There was a long, comfortable silence. The future hung between them, a vast, unwritten page. There was no talk of him moving back in, no easy resolution. The damage was too deep for that. A fine piece of china that has been shattered and glued back together may still hold water, but the cracks will always be visible. "The poems," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "your poems, they were brutal. and they were the most honest things anyone has ever said to me. They saved me in a strange way. They forced me to see. They saved me too, she admitted. They gave my rage a place to live, so it wouldn't live inside me. When it was time to leave, they stood, and for a moment, it seemed he might try to hug her, but he didn't. He just met her eyes, and his were filled with a deep, sorrowful respect. "Goodbye, Eleanor," he said. "Goodbye, Liam." She turned and walked away, toward the Beacon Street entrance of the park. She didn't look back. The air was cool and clean, filled with the promise of the new season. She felt the weight of the past, but it was no longer a burden that bent her to the ground. It was simply part of her, like the ink stains on her fingers, a permanent mark of the story she had lived. She did not know what the next chapter held, and for the first time in a very long time, that uncertainty felt less like a threat and more like freedom. The page was blank, and the pen was in her hand.